Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on maritime transport decarbonisation, what to expect from the new regulatory frameworks. My name is Jonathan Stern, and I'm a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And this webinar is based on a paper which the OIES published at the end of last year called The Decarbonisation of the Maritime Transport, Navigating Between a Global and an EU Approach by Maria Olczak and Andris Piebalgs. Before I ask Maria to make a more detailed presentation of the paper, I'd like to ask Andris to introduce the subject. Andris is part-time professor at the European University Institute, but maybe all of us remember him better as former EU Energy Commissioner. Andris, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, the idea of the paper actually indirectly started already a couple of years ago when we have starting a workshop on introduction of methane in emission trading scheme. So we tried with Maria really to encourage this opinion, and well, the response was not very much positive. So from the communities that dealing with climate change. During the recent times, there have been quite substantial change or revolution in maritime transport. Methane emissions, at least partially, is in ETS. So the whole idea was to look for this methane angle and ETS in maritime. But when you go into depths, it means that actually the subject should be something different, because in the meantime, we have ETS, we have methane emissions, methane regulation, we have also Fuel EU Maritime, and each of regulatory frameworks try to regulate something in the same area. So at the end of the day, you really need to focus not only on ETS, but on the whole maritime sector decarbonization, where part of this decarbonization effort is also methane. There is also particular interests coming from security of supply point. EU has changed very strongly its supply of natural gas. Nearly half of it is coming from LNG, and as we anticipate, this proportion could be even higher. So whatever is being done in decarbonization definitely is very much related with the flows that EU get. So that's why we decided to look on comprehensive view of all the issues related on the decarbonization of maritime sector, and also not moving away from International Maritime Organization's efforts. So it is EU regulation that really boldly comes in it, but there is also international framework, and there is also angle of security of supply. So there is a lot of subjects, so it is really very comprehensive paper where we look on the main issues. We found some elements where some discrepancies are, but you will see it from the presentation of my colleague Maria Olczak.
Thank you very much, Andris. So I will try to share my screen.
Just before you do, Maria, I should tell everyone who you are, and I should remind them, as I should have reminded them at the start, that please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, then I'll know where to look for them. So Maria is the Quantification, Measurement, Reporting and Verification Research Fellow at OIES, which is very difficult to say, so we just call her the QMRV Fellow. And Maria, we're looking forward to what you have to say. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I will start with a big picture first. Maritime transport accounts for almost 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and this translates into slightly more than 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent. The CO2 equivalent indicates that we are not looking at one greenhouse gas, but actually at 3 different greenhouse gases. So CO2 or carbon dioxide, and 2 short-lived greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. And because of the international character of these emissions, they are regulated by the International Maritime Organization. And last year, the IMO published the revised greenhouse gas reduction strategy, which set a net zero target by around 2050. What it actually means is that the sector needs to decarbonize by 2050, and it also needs to decarbonize on a well-to-wake basis, which means that we are not only looking at the emissions upon the combustion of fuels, but also on all the emissions that happen upstream. And this will be a significant challenge because, as you can see on this slide, a majority of the fuels that are currently used come from fossil fuels. And the only alternative fuel that has been picking up over the last few years has been LNG, or liquefied natural gas, which is nothing else than just almost pure methane that has been cooled down to liquefied form. So the key question is actually why LNG became so popular. So when you contrast different types of fuels that are used in the sector, you definitely need to look at least three parameters. So the energy density, the sustainability, and the cost and the availability of the infrastructure. And currently, LNG ticks all the boxes. Even if you look at the sustainability, majority of the policies and regulations that are currently in place, they are focused on the reduction of CO2 emissions, sulfur, and NOx, and LNG helps to reduce all of them. However, with the increasing use of LNG, there is an increasing scrutiny over the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the use of LNG. And there are a lot of different LCA studies out there, but I looked at one peer-reviewed study, and the only peer-reviewed study that actually involved direct measurement of CO2 and methane emissions on a board of LNG cargo ship, led by Dr. Paul Balcombe. And I included all the numbers that result from this study on the top left of the slide. But I think the key question is actually what are the main takeaways. So the first one is that actually the engines and the combustion of fuels is the major source of both CO2 and methane. And this comes as no surprise, as there is always part of methane that is not fully combusted during the process. This is called methane slip. What was quite surprising in this case, actually, quite a high methane slip from the auxiliary engines. So those are the engines that are used for the production of electricity on board of the ship. The second thing away is that actually the methane slip is very much related to the engine load operation. So if we operate at the lower engine loads, there is potentially like higher methane slip. And this was also confirmed in the recent ICCT study. And also they showed that if the load is below 50%, it becomes even more variable. And the last takeaway is actually we need to be aware of the heterogeneity of the LNG fleeting ship. We have currently over 650 vessels in operation, which have completely different setup, the engine, type of engine, and also operational mode. So we cannot assume that, for instance, the venting and fugitives are always that low as it was the case of this ship. And that brings me to the key topic of today's webinar, which are the major regulatory changes. So I will start with the global level, which is the International Maritime Organization. So as I mentioned, we have the 2050 objective, and apart from that, we have also the midterm objectives for 2030 and 2040. And we also need policies in order to achieve these objectives. So we have already the so-called short-term measures already in place, and they focus mostly on the reduction of improved energy efficiency. And we also need more policies, the so-called mid-term measures. And we also know that the midterm measures will be composed of two elements. So the technical element, which is the marine fuel intensity standard, and the second component will be the economic instrument greenhouse gas pricing element. And we also know that in order these measures to be fully implemented by mid-2027, they need to be adopted around 2025. Which also means that in around 1 month, when the next MEPC meeting is planned, MEPC is the committee at the IMO that deals with these issues, they need to at least find some sort of agreement around the conceptual the conceptual level around these two mechanisms. Now, how does it compare to the situation in the EU? So in the EU, we also have the long-term 2050 objective, and there is a mid-term objective to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. Under the Fit for 55 package, the maritime transport has been fully implemented and should fully also contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gases in the EU. And we have a lot of measures, but I will just focus on those that matter for our discussion. So we have EU ETS directive and also revised EU MRV maritime regulation, and I will talk about it on my next slide. Apart from that, we have also Fuel EU Maritime, which is sort of equivalent to the technical elements of the mid-term measure under the IMO. Then we have also the supply side, so increased supply of renewable fuels also for the maritime transport. So we have the Renewable Energy Directive, and we also need infrastructure. So we have another regulation around that. And last but not least, the regulation that is usually overlooked in the context of the maritime transport, but I think will be increasingly important as well, is the methane regulation. And methane regulation has not been adopted yet. It will be adopted in the coming months, as we already concluded the trilogues. But I think that the most interesting element for our discussion is actually Chapter 5, with the requirements that the regulation imposes on the importers of fossil fuels, including also LNG, into the EU, with the MRV equivalency starting from 2027, and then most probably some sort of methane intensity limits afterwards. Now, going back to the EU ETS, actually, what has changed already? So as of the beginning of this year, the CO2 emissions that are really reported by the ships, they are subject to surrender allowance, to surrender obligations, which means for every ton of the CO2 that is released, the companies need to surrender the allowances. And as of 2026, this requirement will also apply to emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. What is really interesting is at the beginning this year, which you can see for the yellow dots, actually methane and nitrous oxide will need to be reported by the companies. Then the second thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that actually the geographical scope of ETS. So it covers 100% of the emissions from the voyages within the EU, and only 50% of the emissions that happen from the voyages starting and ending outside of the EU. And this is because of the fact that when Commission was proposing the measures, it was aware of the measures and mindful of the measures that should soon be adopted at the IMO level. Now, EU ETS, in contrast to the IMO, adopts the tank-to-wake approach, which means that we are only looking at the emissions associated with the combustion of fossil fuels used on board. And the companies can choose either to calculate those emissions, and this is the standard practice right now, or to directly measure those emissions. Now, the key question here is actually what do we make out of these changes? And so there are three, I think, main messages that I would like to highlight. So the first is obvious. Shipping sector is under the growing decarbonization pressure for sure. But I think for the sector, in terms of the policy developments, the years after 2025 will be even more interesting. This is because the EU ETS directive includes the revision clause, which means that depending on the developments at the IMO level, the EU ETS needs to be revised in order to account for these changes. Or if we don't have an agreement at the IMO level, the ETS could be extended to even 100% of the emissions associated with the voyages that start or end outside of the EU. And the same principle also applies to the Fuel EU Maritime regulation, which sets the greenhouse gas intensity standards for the fuels used on board of the ships. The second message is around how methane is regulated under in the EU. So now we have two different regulatory regimes, EU ETS and EU methane regulation. And those instruments have completely different philosophies when it comes to the measurements of emissions. So EU regulation for the methane emissions focuses on the direct measurement of methane, both on the source and site level, whereas ETS allows also the estimation, which brings, I think, a couple of questions around the uncertainty of those estimates, given the financial implications of the EU ETS. Now, the third message is around the cost of compliance and the impact of on the industry. And I think there is also a very interesting set of questions around how IMO level to
Maria, can you hear us? I guess you're having a connection issue. We lost you for a moment.
Okay. I'm hoping we're going to get Maria back anytime soon. Okay, I'm going to leave it just a minute or two to see if she can log in again. If not, we will move on with discussants, but hopefully she will come back to us. Maria, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm back.
Okay, great.
I think I
Karen,
breached.
we lost the last couple of points you were making, so perhaps you could just go back there.
Okay, I will just show my slides again. Okay. Okay, so
No, it's yeah. No,
okay.
it's earlier, Maria.
Okay.
Yes, you have been under the second point,
Okay.
the direct measurements versus estimates, and then we lost you.
Okay, sorry. So the third point is about the impact on the LNG industry with regards to the cost of compliance with EU ETS and also the need for the changes in the contractual arrangements. But also, I think there is one more interesting question around how different targets that have been adopted at the IMO level and also the regulation at the EU level, how it will affect the national LNG policy targets across the world, also, especially I'm looking here at Asia, and also on the LNG order book. And that brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. And I just want to stress the fact that this is indeed a critical decade for setting the industry on the course for net zero. And some of difficult decision needs to be taken in this decade. Then the second thing is around the regulatory uncertainty, as now or like very soon we will have most probably not only one but two different regulatory regimes. So I think the question is actually what happens by 2028, whether we will have one global standard adopted at the IMO level, or there will be more regional regulations like the EU ETS. And then even if we have agreement at the IMO level, how the EU ETS and Fuel EU Maritime regulation will be adjusted to account for the changes at the IMO level. And then a little bit of broader questions around what exactly Andy said at the very beginning of presentation, as the current decarbonization policies put LNG at a certain disadvantage, but given the fact that LNG played a very important role during the energy crisis, it raises some questions around the balance between energy security, sustainability, and affordability. And then there is a set of questions around the supply of renewable fuels also for the maritime sector, especially after 2030, when the targets become more stringent. And last but not least, it's also the question around what the industry should do, given the fact that the demand for energy could evolve across different sectors and regions. And last but not least is that what are the best decisions to be taken in the short term and in the long term, given the increasing policy uncertainty. So I believe we addressed at least some of the questions in our policy brief, but I'm happy to tackle more of them during the event. Thank you.
Maria, thanks very much and well done for getting back. I just remind you again, we are very happy to see your questions in the Q&A. So now we move to two discussants. And the first of this is Bartek Gorba, who works at DG Klima at the European Commission in the unit dealing with the emissions from shipping. He focuses on green corridors for shipping, IMO negotiations, and the Innovation Fund for Maritime. And he previously worked on energy policy in the European Commission, including on gas and hydrogen markets. So I guess he's really, really well placed to give us his views on this subject. Bartek, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning. Hello, basically, to everyone, wherever you are hearing me. Thank you very much also, Maria, for this very good overview. That, of course, also makes my remarks easier. I think what I would like to stress is to give you a little bit maybe deeper understanding of the overall connections between the different legislation that has been adopted, and a little bit of the why it is there. And I think here is important to start. We have a clear direction of travel. We have decarbonization or climate neutrality goal to achieve in European Union by 2050. It's important to remember that this is a legally binding goal. So it's not just a declaration, a strategy. It's legally binding. There is a climate law applicable in the EU. And with that, we are developing, of course, the instruments that we have at hand, in particular EU ETS, to match this target. And as of 1st January this year, ETS applies indeed to maritime sector, to all ships above 5,000 tonnage arriving and leaving EU ports. And indeed, for the first time, also we are monitoring, and soon, 2 years time, will be also requesting to surrender our allowances also for methane emissions. Here, it's important to stress this: methane emissions and CO2 emissions are required to be surrendered for emissions or slippage from the engine. So it goes about the propulsion of the ship. We are not talking here about any possible slippage from if there is any, from the cargo for the LNG ships. It's only about what is really being used, the gas being used for propulsion of the ship. So that's first regarding the scope. This is important to remember. I will shortly touch also about the methane regulation, and you will see that there is no overlap between the two instruments. So here we're talking about how to make the ship moving. And then indeed in this area we have the EU ETS and the Fuel EU. And this and Fuel EU Maritime regulates also propulsion of shipping. More precisely, it requires ship operators to lower the GHG intensity of their fuels used on board of the ships. There is a trajectory. In the beginning, relatively low, starting 2%, 6% by 2030. So slowly growing up to 80% GHG reduction on ships from the fuels used on the ship until 2050. So why now the ETS and why the Fuel EU together? We call it this incentives on both sides. The Fuel EU works more on the input side. So we require that the owners buy fuels, and that on input to the ship there are fuels that are less GHG intensive. The ETS works much more on the side of outputs, on really how the transport is performed. There, it's not only a matter of which fuel you use, but also how energy efficient the ship is, how the hull is built, how quickly you travel. So you can, in order to lower the bill, you can use various technologies, not only fuels. And both instruments, the fuel standard and the ETS with the price, help to cover the price difference between the conventional fuels and the non-emitting fuels. And this is very important, the interplay between the two instruments. This is the experience we have in the EU, and this logic we are also trying to convince our partners in the IMO that we need, next to the fuel standard, also a levy, a worldwide levy on shipping emissions, in order to help match the two the prices of the fuels. Of course, a ETS and also maybe if this is adopted, a levy in the future bring revenues, and these revenues can be used to incentivize investments. In the EU, we have an innovation fund, but also revenues in 3/4 go to the member states budget, and they also spend 100% of these revenues on investments reducing CO2 emissions. So I think adding this together, without ETS, we wouldn't have revenues to invest in technologies, and without the fuel EU, we wouldn't have the pressure, demand pressure of to get less emitting fuels on the market. I think this is important to remember, and this is precisely the position of the EU for the negotiations on IMO. We will see whether indeed the measures are adopted. We hope so. That also the calendar will be kept until 2025. Measures should be, or in 2025, the measures should be adopted at IMO level. And indeed, we will then see, and Maria mentioned this, in both Fuel EU and EU ETS, we have also the review clauses. We will be assessing, we're obliged to assess to which extent they are the measures adopted at IMO don't also put a double burden on companies, precisely to preserve the environmental objectives in the union, but also avoid double burden when that would arise if, for example, a market measure is also adopted at the IMO. So these review clauses are quite heavy. Will be a quite broad assessment to be done. And this will then happen around 2026 when we also have clarity at IMO level. What is sure, we will be looking to preserve the environmental effectiveness of the measures when it comes to achieving the targets in the EU. So this is one of the main elements to assess. And now maybe just 2 words, because indeed the methane regulation was mentioned. I must say this is a little bit outside of the of DG Klima. This is more DG Energy. So our colleagues in the energy department dealing with that. So I will just mention this briefly. This is indeed a regulation that is not yet adopted, is under negotiations, but it is already clear what the general political agreement is. This agreement has been reached already in November, and now soon the regulation will be published. The regulation looks at how to measure indeed emissions, methane emissions on the production side of oil, gas, and in coal sectors. And it is also looking and incentivizing the international partners. So it's also incentivizing companies that import oil, gas, and coal to report on annual basis the methane emissions. And the process starts in several steps. So first, there is a simple obligation to report about annual emissions. Then in the next step, 2027, there will be already some more justification necessary. whether and the Commission will be looking that the monitoring outside of the EU is also in the same scope or equivalent to the measurements that are being done in the EU. Then the Commission will develop also a methodology that will then become obligatory also for the importing of emissions. And then as a last step, as of 2031, there will be certain methane and intensity established, and it will be necessary to meet this methane intensity, not to go beyond, because then there will be also penalties for that. So there is a certain calendar that will apply, but it is indeed in particular looking into measurement of emission on the production side. Plus, when it comes to transport, it is looking about emissions from the pipelines. So pipelines, transmission pipelines, distribution pipelines. This regulation normally doesn't apply on ships. So again, here there is no overlap between the two regulations. Okay, I hope this will be the short overview from my side, and back to you, Jonathan.
Bartek, thank you very much. I think we'll probably come back to some of the points that you made in the Q&A. Please do keep your questions coming. So, excuse me, our second participant discussant is Fiji George. Fiji is Senior Director for Climate and Sustainability at Cheniere. He's in Houston, so he's got up very early in the morning to be with us. Fiji, welcome, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. I want to thank FSR and OIES for hosting today, and especially applaud the work that Maria and Andres have done on the paper and taking the time to summarize it today. So today I want to focus on the sections of their paper that looks at the contradictions between the EU ETS regulations and the EU methane rules, and how it applies the implications on LNG. So just a quick background on Cheniere for folks who are not aware. We are the largest LNG operator out of the US, one of the largest LNG charterers in the world. So far, we have exported over 3,200 LNG cargoes around the world since inception in 2016, with about 48% of our volumes delivered to Europe. We are the largest exporter of LNG to the EU in 2022 and 2023, with about 72% of the volumes produced landing in Europe. So what is our climate strategy? It involves using science and data to inform solutions for environmental management and mitigation across the supply chain. So not just at the liquefaction terminals or the shipping terminals, but a holistic view. So this is mainly because we want to ensure the long-term role of natural gas. We feel that industry has to prove our GHG emission footprints, especially through reduction of methane emissions and transparently reporting performance. As some of you know, we initiated what is called the Quantification, Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification, or QMRV program in 2021, with academics from University of Texas, Colorado State, Colorado School of Mines, who have now collaborated with OIES to form the Energy Emissions Modeling Data Lab, or MDEL. And the goal was to test out multiple technologies, methods, and develop models to accurately report measurement-based data sets. We were also the sponsors of the study that Maria mentioned by Dr. Paul Balcom at QMUL, which included the first measurements on one of our charter vessels. So as Mr. Gruber outlined, there are three major policies focused on emissions related to shipping in the EU. But the questions are, the first is the issue that Maria and Andres raised, the contradiction with the EU methane rule. Secondly is contradictions with global policies, including IMO and US regulations. And third is, how would all these things play out? A market-based approach with a performance-based approach, and Mr. Gruber explained that pretty well. So I want to focus on the main contradiction in the OIES study is the way emissions are estimated, especially for methane. So EU methane emissions, EU methane regulations emphasizes direct measurements due to uncertainties with engineering emission factor-based methods, whereas the shipping regulations mostly employ default emission factors based on the fuel type and conventional engineering methods. While CO2 from combustion of the fuels used on ships is the main source of emissions, methane slip may also need to be reviewed through more studies. We all know CO2 has less uncertainties than methane emissions in general, but methane emissions from ships matter. Our work through peer review showed that emissions from LNG shipping segment, when you look at the entire value chain from production through the regas terminal, that accounts for about 13% of the total GHG intensity. And this is when it's delivered to Europe. If for cargoes from US to Asia, it's approximately 25%. Our work also indicates that methane emissions from the shipping segment on a well-to-wake basis. So what is well-to-wake? It is from production all the way to shipping, can be over 25% on a 100-year basis and close to 50% on a 20-year basis. And I presume everybody knows that methane is more potent, and so it has a bigger impact on a 20-year basis. So point here is methane matters from the shipping segments. Now, the EU maritime rules call for the use of default methane slip rates to be used in the engineering estimation process, depending on the type of engine it's used. Similarly, the fuel EU regulations require operators to use default well-to-wake factors depending on the engine types depending on type of engines. Now, I recognize there is an option for measurements, but what I expect is most people will be just using the conventional default factors. Now, what is important is to acknowledge the differentiation of technologies and fuel suppliers to incentivize regulations. For example, under the EU MRV or the Fuel EU, methane slip factors are constant across all broad LNG vessels. Say an XDF or a Mega or a low-speed Auto two-stroke engine architecture all must use the same default 1.7% methane slip rate. This means ships with lower methane slip designs are not able to report lower methane emissions. Conversely, as Maria pointed out in the Balcom study, ships with high auxiliary engine emissions, due to whatever reasons, are not incentivized to change change the behavior because the methane slip is fixed. Secondly, as Maria and Andres pointed out, boil-off gas of BOC is not fully accounted or addressed in the shipping ETS rule, if not routed as fuel. Current regulations require reporting of fuel consumption. Okay, in some cases, BOC is not used for fuel consumption, but it's sent to the gas combustion unit, where it is combusted and from methane is converted to CO2. The assumptions one makes on the BOC can significantly impact the GHG and methane emissions. Now, we've seen third parties may claim that the operator is not accurately representing their emissions into the ETS, though the operator fully followed the prescribed regulations. In addition, we have seen recently some have made incorrect assumptions using cherry-picked or outdated data to claim BOC in excess of fuel requirements is fully vented and therefore comes out as methane and therefore making claims of higher GHG intensities than what we have seen, what we have measured or estimated. Now, I raised this because in the US, operators have been following the EPA regulatory methods for over a decade. But as you know, there have been series of studies that have indicated emissions are higher when measured, leading to concerns about the reported emissions and therefore questioning the credibility of the EPA regulatory program. So this is a point that the EU should consider when you issue default factors. What happens when studies show different rates? So similarly, with performance standards approach in the EU regulations, where default factors, if you're using fossil fuels on the ship, you're assigned default factors from well to wake and tank to wake segments. So what is, again, just a reminder, well to wake is from production to the shipping. So for all the fuels used on the ship, you got to use a default, what is called a life cycle well to tank emission rate. So there's no opportunity for companies to show lower life cycle intensity for fossil marine fuels, nor direct measurement to inform ship-specific methane slip factors, for the points I raised earlier. Recognizing that the fuel EU rules target intensities of the fuel used on board, LCA principles, the use of default factors, in my opinion, negates the opportunity to show better performance. And also, especially when the fuel use is sourced from a lower supply chain where methane and GHG mitigation policies are implemented. For example, if a ship is using LFO or LNG sourced through a supply chain with poor methane or no methane or GHG mitigation regulations, they use the same default values as the source of those fuels from a country with very strong regulatory standards on methane and GHGs. This lack of customization and acknowledgement that several countries like the US do have stringent methane rules now in the books for new and existing facilities across the supply chain prevents the differentiation of these supply chains for providing these fuels. And for example, many of you know the US EPA has proposed rules which will reduce methane emissions by 1.5 billion tons, 1.5 billion tons, or 80% by 2035. And this makes, in our opinion, the US supply chains more environmentally competitive than LNG cargo, LNG or gas, other gas exporters from a well-to-wake basis. So that, we believe, needs to be accounted for to this differentiation. So also, we also want to bring up the use of default factors contradicts to what the EU and the US has communicated publicly on developing common life cycle assessment tools for hydrocarbon suppliers and purchasers to improve the accuracy and transparency of the data at cargo, portfolio, operator, jurisdiction, and basin level. So that's out in the public. Also, some of you may know about the EU taxonomy rules. They ask you to use the ISO or standard life cycle analysis to assess specific gas activities as environmentally sustainable. So this, again, customization is not just there in the EU methane rule, but also in the EU taxonomy and other regulations. Therefore, the recommendation to the Commission is to consider measurement studies to update default factors, including methane slip factors, plus give the opportunity to employ bespoke values for various fuels used on the ship using ISO or peer-reviewed LCA tools to compute these life cycle emissions. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for using direct measurements as the only option, right? But the key point is that using predefined methane slip rates as outlined in the December 14th Delegated Act for various ships propulsion systems may need to be tested through multiple studies to account for the reality of differences in well-to-wake profiles. This would clearly support the differentiation and transparency of various suppliers rather than resorting to a one-size computation regardless of the intensity of where these fuels came from. Now, one more point before I close. When I call for differentiation, it's not meant to claim any premium or green label on the gas or LNG sold. Rather, the measurement-informed data sets gathered and employed, approved by a EU standard or international standard, or at least peer-reviewed, can provide rich data sets to all stakeholders, whether it's the regulator, operator, and the public, to make informed decision on the product bought, sold, and more importantly, reduce emissions. So this is consistent with the methane transparency database concept included in the EU methane rule. That's why it was created, and also provides a check against claims made by some on higher or lower emission rates from the supply chain, including shipping. And this would avoid advocacy-based papers to influence public policy, as we have seen recently in the US. At the end, verification and repeatability is, in my opinion, the bedrock of trust in public policy and science, not tall claims based on cherry-picked data or differentiation claimed on default or outdated factors. Now, finally, I want to end with a couple more points. I want to communicate the fantastic work that Andrea and Maria have done. So what does it really mean for an operator? So we've analyzed these regulations quite a bit. So roughly speaking, for a 170,000 cubic meter vessel making a round trip between US and Europe using HFO or LNG post 2026, we estimate an incremental cost north of about 5 cents a million BTU. But keep in mind, the cost will vary based on multiple factors, including engine speed, type, the EUA cost, destination, etc. Further, the LNG vessels and operator and charters like us are having to spend significant time and cost setting up internal systems and controls and processes to comply with the rules. Example, updates to software, the EU ETS account opening, contractual amendments, new internal reporting lines and billing processes. This is all new to us, right? So this is a new requirement for all of us. And finally, one final thought. I hope what Mr. Gruber mentioned about coordination with IMO is really important to avoid the double burden. So while these regulations may support support the capitalization of operators to act quickly to reduce emissions, one issue to consider is the issue of leakage due to discrepancy between regulatory requirements in the EU with the EU ETS and the FEO EU and elsewhere. So the question to ask is, could the EU rules have a perverse impact where a cleaner, more efficient fleet is routed to the EU and more CO2 intensive vessels are chartered to other destinations? Therefore, this is really important. We need to have a consistent clarity and a regulatory framework for the entire shipping segment. So I'll close with those thoughts. Happy to take questions, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiji. I just want to throw, you've all mentioned the methane regulation and very understandably so. And I just want to throw at you, well, first of all, I'd just like you to briefly give your reflections on the draft that we currently have. And I just remind you that one of the questions at the end of the paper is, what changes are necessary to better align the EU MRV maritime regulation and the EU methane regulation to provide more consistent approach for monitoring, reporting and verification that Fiji kind of mentioned towards the end of his remarks. So Andres, why don't I start with you to give us your reflections on that?
Yeah, well, I think we really need to understand the consequence. I think what Fiji said was very crucial because regulations are agreed. They will be formally adopted, they come out. So it's not so easy to change them. So they are well meant, and Bartek said, well, there is no overlapping. We have really considered the main elements. What we see, perhaps they will not make any perverse impact on the process, but there is some things that we have not tested. It is something new, and it comes with regulatory instruments, and regulatory instruments are never perfect in itself. What we would like to establish, I think, in the EU and also in globally, that the regulations serve decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in shipping. So that's the whole goal in it. And if there would be definitely need to change something, there is a revision both of ETS, and there is a revision also on this or methane regulation, and there could be adjustments. So what we would really need, it's extremely good cooperation with industry to really to see how does it impact industry, and that it is works in the way the regulation have been conceived to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, providing incentives for new fuels or more cleaner, more efficient shipping.
Thanks. Bartek, do you want to add anything to what you've already said on this subject?
Yes, indeed, because I didn't go into this measurement issue, and it was rightly pointed out by Fiji and also by Andres. That there is indeed this this difference of approaches. Maybe so the methane regulation indeed is looking precisely about is requiring monitoring and reporting, and it will be a process that also, you know, the commission, we will all be learning how this reporting monitoring is being done, and then a methodology will be developed. So I think this is a perfect room for precisely you know, developing the most suitable approach. Now for the shipping, ETS in shipping, we indeed went for the default values, and the reason is, and Andres, I think, perfectly mentioned this. So it is a new sector being brought into ETS. Of course, you know, and this will, since EU is a important destination for ships from all over the world, it's really a legislation that affects around the world. So we need, of course, most of the ships were already subject to MRV for some time, but still the ship owners, managing companies are now facing a lot of new tasks, and I think Fiji mentioned this as well. So indeed, going with the default values was perceived as being less burdensome than demanding installation of measurements on ships. But of course, we also will be learning and monitoring the implementation. And we have in the ETS for stationary, we have this 3-tier approach. One starts with the default values, and if the company shows that it can actually produce and verified reports that are showing lower emissions, can go for more precise measurements and so on. So in stationary installations, we do have it already. Now we will need to see whether on the ships, also technologically, whether we will have a good measurement devices and enough, because what I understood, there is not much on ships to measure it. And also, more importantly, it's not only about methane, right? We need also to monitor other fuels. It's also for biofuels and and also for methane for H2. So it is sorry, for methanol and for ammonia maybe. So it is, ammonia is maybe less of a problem. Methanol, still there are some additional emissions. So it is more multi-fuel issue. So just as a reaction, we are monitoring and we will be coming with the review, and this is certainly one of the important topics. So yeah, we'll need to have a cooperation with the industry on that.
Great, thanks. Fiji, what I wanted to ask you, whatever, I'm conscious of time, but you mentioned the joint EU-US initiatives on this. I mean, how do you see the congruence between what's happening in the US and what's happening in the? I'm thinking of OGMP 2.0, which I think is still not received complete acceptance from some of the major US companies. Maybe you could talk us through a little bit about whether you see there might be future problems between the EU and the US on this.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. So, just a full disclosure, Cheniere is part of the OGMP 2.0, and we completely support their goals and their work. So, just first, for folks who do not know OGMP 2.0, OGMP 2.0 lets you start with default values, but the goal is in about 3 to 5 years, you got to use measurement to report your emissions. Shipping is not fully covered under OGP 2.0, so that's a black box. And so what we have to now start considering is, how do we do these measurements, and how do we get better data for people like Bart and others, not just in the EU, but in the US and the IMO? How can we make informed decisions? So the way out I see is what the process that the OGMP 2.0 and now in the US, we've recognized that we have to move towards measurement data, because the regulations that I was talking about that was criticized, that has been enforced for over a decade now, was based on engineering estimated factors, and those factors were outdated or not representative. And now what the EPA and the U.S. Congress has asked them to do is move towards measurements, and there's a lot of investment from U.S. EPA and the Department of Energy to move towards that. So the architecture and the framework of the OGMP 2.0 is there. The concept is there. That's sort of, I would say, sort of recognized by the U.S. Regulatory bodies. We have to move also towards measurements. Now, I think the same concept is recognized with the EU methane rules, which are asking for emissions that are measured for the operators in EU, and for the exporting country, producers and pipeline companies have to show equivalency or comparability with the same standards that the EU is looking at. So there is a convergence that is happening through these bespoke regulations, and also sort of like an indirect impact of the EU regulations. A lot of people like me are starting to think about, when I work for Cheniere, we export to 37 countries and regions all around the world. How do you build these standards that are compatible to everybody, right? Governance policies. It's just not about the math, but it's also about the science that is required, the controls that are required, the governance that are required. And with the EU ETS, right? The burden is on the ship owner. We are the charters. We don't own the ship. So how does that all work together? These are all complex issues that our teams over here at Cheniere and our legal teams are all working on. So there is a lot of work to be done, but my recommendation is the move towards measurements should be made, especially because of the fact that methane, as I mentioned, is a significant part. And the prior EU ETS for shipping did not include methane. It's a new thing. It's highly uncertain. We have installed continuous monitors in a couple of our charters. We're looking at the data, and we hope to publish some of these results and share the results with DG Climate and others, because more work needs to be done, and better the data, the more clarity on the ETS, because we do not want to be in a situation where somebody questions that we didn't turn enough allowances or not. So that uncertainty with methane needs to be sorted out, and the credibility of the regulations should also stand based on this fact of the OGMP sort of concept, or the US current EPA thinking, or the EU methane thinking, which is moving towards measurements.
Okay, just checking, Maria, would you like to say anything on anything you've heard so far?
Yes, so maybe just two quick comments from my side, and I hope the internet will be working now. What Bartek said was really interesting, but in terms of like technologies for the measurement of emissions on board of the ship, especially if we talk about the methane slip, I think we are already like almost there. Like we could use technologies like FTIR, and they allow for continuous measurement of emissions. So I think it shouldn't be that of a challenge. And I think this is what I at least expect from some of the ship owners after the 1st of January 2024 is actually, even though they are not legally required to measure their emissions, they will do that because they will need to adjust their contracts, and there will be some financial implications. And this is the case of the ship owners that believe their methane emissions are in a good range below the standard emission factors. I think those that are in the worst group, I think they would just hide behind the standard emission factors. And how big the first and the second group is, I think that's difficult to say. And the second comment regarding the EU methane regulation is that, and again, this is more like a broader discussion as we followed the developments at the FSR, like in terms of like methane regulation and methane strategy that was published in 2020 as of the very beginning of this topic. And it seems to me like there is a little bit of policy maybe change and the change of the approach, as initially there was a lot of discussion around the methane supply index. So the idea was to have better understanding of all the emissions happening from the upstream until like the border of the EU. Now it seems, I also tried to, like a couple of times, try to read the latest version of the EU methane regulation. It looks like maybe the approach is slightly more focusing on the production side. But again, I think we need a little bit more explanation also from DG Energy regarding what's the current thinking and exactly how we should interpret what is in the EU methane regulation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to go to an interesting question that's come in, which says, next to the availability of clean fuels for shipping, one might wonder whether sufficient natural gas up to EU standards for methane will be available in the market. And if not, then what? I'm tempted to start with you, Fiji, on this.
I'm pretty confident, right? If you ask us, Cheniere, right? If we have clarity on the regulations, we will get there, right? But we need that absolute clarity is really important. I've got no doubt about the supply, and look, Jonathan, I've been in this business for close to 3 decades now, and it's extremely marvelous to see the amount of progress that we've made in the past 5 years with technology, measurement technologies. It is just amazing. And so I am very, very bullish that we can crack the code. Fixing methane emissions is easy. There's a lot of work being done on the efficiency and reducing CO2, and you got better engines that are happening, and you can see the order book that Maria mentioned, right? We're moving to a cleaner fleet. So between that and cleaning up methane upstream, at least from Shanir's perspective and the U.S. LNG perspective, there are technologies and policies in place to incentivize it. Now, can I say that similarly to my competition globally? I don't know. That's a decision that the Commission and the IMO and others have to make. And yeah, so I'll stop at that.
Okay, so let me put this to Bartek and to Andris. So let's leave aside the US where you've got all this great stuff going on. But what about, I mean, we can be confident about Norway. We've seen their data. They are already going to meet anything that anyone's going to introduce. But what about some of the other suppliers? What about, you know, Algeria, Nigeria? What do we do about countries where we are, shall we say, less confident about their ability and willingness to provide data which will be acceptable to EU standards? And I'm trying not to anticipate squabbles and conflict between the EU and its gas and LNG suppliers along the lines of, well, we don't believe your data, even though you say you're meeting the intensity standard. So I think we just need to be clear that you know, the US is the US, and we have much more confidence about what they're doing. What about some other countries, Bartek?
Look, I will be maybe I will maybe once also again give an example from the shipping area, where we had this similar discussion when the sulfur standards were introduced into fuels, and then there was basically, yeah, where you get the fuel from, this is impossible and so on. And after the regulation, still the market adapted quite quickly. I think also here we are not talking about, it's not about the quality of methane. It is about, the way how you produce it and how you then put into pipeline, how you transport it. So these are issues that are possible to also then demand from the regulatory side, but also to be fixed between the companies in contracts. And that's why I would be optimistic. I think it is, since companies are adjusting in many other fields when they sell goods in Europe, I think it's also will be the case here. So I would be rather optimistic. And one more thing is, as I said, it is a process in several steps, and we will be looking around what are the developments and how to when then also the intensity standard is being set and which methodology is being then recommended by the Commission. This will be all elements to consider.
Andris?
Yeah, I will be quite optimistic, because I think it's always difficult really to agree on regulation, because there's a lot of different interests and to find. But as soon as it's agreed, we have three basic elements in place. First of all, we have a regulation, and there are penalties for non-compliance. So there are consequences if importer has not complied with the rules. There are some possibilities to avoid, but no one in his own mind would like to avoid it. So I think that is the first thing. The second thing is a new technology coming from this methane set. We will have by far better data from space. So that means we will have rather good data sets that would quite clearly indicate, does what is reported really corresponds to the actual emissions. And last but not least, I always believe that humanity, hardly press, is trying to do its best. And for me, this oil and gas decarbonization charter, if properly supported and pushed, it makes a difference. It really makes a difference. Why industry would try to sabotage. They basically say by 2030 we will be near zero, and it is majority of industry, 40% of the oil and gas producer. That is an enormous peer pressure. Until now, it was have been all in climate initiative, not so many companies. Now it is a big change, and we could advance also on COP29 during Azerbaijan meetings. That it's again to get some more transparency requirement, reporting requirements, because it's very good that if you have top-down data, it's correspondence with bottom-up reporting. So there is a positive drive, and as long as the rules are clear, and that I think what we tried in Marie's paper to look are not that sometimes that makes confrontational rules, that if there is something that will confuse the industry to go in the direction, that I think is a risk if you have many pieces of regulation. And at the same we also definitely favor that IMO is making the global industry rules, so it's really it would be great that it is everywhere the same type of approach, and EU has done a very important step that hopefully will encourage IMO to be also courageous and deliver what they're saying, net zero emissions by 2050. But to get there, you need to act now.
Okay, the clock is now against us. I'm gonna very quickly ask Fiji, Bartek, and Andris to respond a minute each on 2 questions, or either one if you can't take the 2 of them. One is, to what extent do you expect the parallel application of FuelEU Maritime to affect the cost effectiveness of the EU ETS? And the other is about wind propulsion, and I just give you the bottom line. Do you expect wind propulsion to be an expanding sector, or will it remain a niche? Bartek, a minute. Unmute.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in particular, I would like this wind question. Very good question. I think ETS is a very good example of regulation that would precisely help wind propulsion to be online. I would like to say that the Commission is paying 400 million for various research projects, and many of them are about wind technologies. We see fantastic ideas around, and many ships are trying this out. And we really hope this will be part of the solution, because we will not have so many, there will be less of these fuels that are meeting at certain moment emission standards, and we will need to have additional technologies to use them efficiently, because there will be also other sectors in the economy using the same fuel. So every wind element you can install will save costs and fuels use. So very positive about that. And yes, of course, the fuel EU is lowering, maybe will be having impact also on cost effectiveness. But I think, as I said, this is the experience we have in the EU. Both measures are necessary. It's not about having, record high prices. It's really to achieve the policy goal, and we achieve it with the 2. I think with then better. With prices that maybe don't skyrocket always like this, if already there is some supply that is forced by the other regulation. So I think we are quite confident having the both tools in place.
Thank you. Fiji, your minute.
Yeah, so just quickly on the confirmation with Fuel EU, and is it cost effective with the EU ETS? It's I would leave it as to be decided, right? I understand the concept that what the Commission is stated on a performance-based rule with a market-based approach. Traditionally, market-based approaches, especially exchanging allowances, you want to make sure that your pollutant has got certainty. Inclusion of methane into the market-based approach is concerning for all the reasons I just mentioned. It probably would have been better to consider methane as part of the EU methane provisions and the adjoining rules, and also through the Fuel EU regulations. So whether it's cost effective or not, it is to be decided. But again, what I emphasize is we need to have one set of rules between the IMO on a global standard. Otherwise, there could be some perverse actions. Finally, with respect to the wind technology, Maria made a very, very important point. The fuel has to be dense, right? we'll see how the research goes and see how this is going to work. Now, if all said and done, if it's going to be a lower cost solution, then all power to the wind, right? There's no harm in using that. But the question is can it meet these standards, or can it be available at scale by the time frame that we're thinking about? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves.
Thanks, Fiji. Andres.
Well, both questions are very much connected, because in ideal case, ETS should do the trick. So you would ask why you need fuel EU Maritime. But because of limited time for the climate change dictated transition, we would need faster penetration of renewable fuels. Even adoption of legislation has led to 2 investment projects that are already moving ahead on methanol. So it's immediately has made an impact. ETS would make an impact, but by far more slower. And that would definitely demonstrate that the wind as a energy efficient technology, and also low carbon technology, gives another niche for this technology. So why it should stay a niche if it's really will be proven? So the regulation is favorable to it, and definitely ship owners and shipbuilders look for now more energy efficiency. So it works on it. So for me, both questions are connected, and for acceleration, we needed this fuel EU maritime regulation. ETS for me should be the major key for transition, because that is a permanent issue that face any industry, because you need to always to improve in your performance of carbon emissions.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry we don't have more time. I think this has been very, very good, and certainly for me, very interesting. So I'm going to pass to Christopher Jones, part-time professor at the European University Institute and former Deputy Director General for Energy, to wrap up for us. Christopher, over to you.
Well, first of all, Jonathan, thank you to you for a great moderation.
Christopher, you've muted somehow. Okay.
First of all, Jonathan, thank you to you for helping us set up this, and in an area which is rarely discussed, I think it's fair to say. I thought what today's session brought out really, really well is the innovation that we've got going on now. The ETS and the Refuel Maritime really is a game changer here, not just at the European level, but it will have an international effect. I thought the comments on the availability of refumbos were extremely important, but as I think most of the people have reflected, the market will reflect or will perform in due time. So I think, given the time, Jonathan, it's best that I leave it there, and simply to thank everybody. Fiji, Bartok, Maria, Andres, and Jonathan, thank you very much indeed.